The sun beats down on this hot July day. The air is warm and still, and we can hear the sounds of insects and distant cars driving down the freeway. We walk slowly through an alfalfa field, scanning the area for any signs of movement. Then, we hear the slow but steady high-pitched chirping of a prairie dog. It's an alarm call to alert the colony that intruders are near. We see a few small heads pop out of dusty holes in the ground, and then quickly disappear back underground. Some other employees check their carefully placed traps near the holes and discover they've managed to catch a few of the small animals. The next steps will include transporting the prairie dogs so they can be weighed, measured, and placed with GPS collars before we drive them down a long, dusty road to a remote area where they will be released into new burrows. This is all part of an intricate balancing act taking place in southern Utah that helps the threatened Utah prairie dogs recover while also protecting the property of local farmers and ranchers. This is Wild, a Utah Division of Wildlife Resources podcast. I'm your host, Faith Heaton Jolly, and this is episode 27, Prairie Dog Relocations. Welcome back to Wild, everyone. I am down here in lovely Cedar City, Utah today in our regional office in this part of the state. I am with two awesome individuals. Adam Cavalunas, he is our Utah prairie dog recovery biologist, and Jessica Kinross is our impact analysis biologist who has also just done a ton of prairie dog work. So thanks for joining me on the podcast today, you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, this is very exciting. And yeah, so I've been down the last 2 days here in southern Utah, kind of watching. I was going to say helping out, but I was not helping. I was mostly just watching some of the prairie dog work that we do. And they're kind of an interesting but kind of misunderstood species a lot of times, especially here in Utah. So let's kind of just dive right in and talk about prairie dogs. So first off, what kind of prairie dogs do we have here in Utah?
Well, we have 5 species total in North America, 3 of which we have here in Utah. Kind of in the northeastern part of the state, we have white-tailed prairie dogs. In the southeastern part of the state, this would be east of the Colorado River, we have the Gunnison prairie dog. And here in southwestern Utah, west of the Colorado River and south of I-70, we have the Utah prairie dog. The Utah prairie dog is the only threatened species of all the prairie dogs in the United States. And so we have a pretty intensive management program here in the southern region.
Okay, so all the other prairie dogs in Utah are doing pretty good except for the ones here that you're helping out.
Correct, yep.
Okay, awesome. And what are kind of some, I guess, unique things about this particular species of prairie dogs?
So the Utah prairie dog, it is the smallest of the white-tailed prairie dogs. They're kind of like cousins to the other ones, and they are definitely the cutest. They have these dark eyebrow patches and these little dark brown, they have dark eyebrows and little dark brown cheek patches.
Their eyebrow game is strong.
Right? Yeah, they've got some pretty nice eyebrows. And it's almost like they put blush on their cheeks.
Right.
But it's a lot more distinct than the other white-tailed prairie dog species. And they have the white tip tail. Adults, generally, they weigh up to 2 to 4 pounds. And they eat plants, grasses, leafy forbs, sometimes insects. They're really social species. They live in burrows. As you went out trapping, you could see that it helps them be a little bit more easily trapped. And they're called prairie dogs because they have alarm barks, and they'll bark at you.
So they do. They kind of sound like a little dog. They're like, "Rah, rah, rah," like little chirps as they're kind of warning other people. So, and that is kind of an interesting thing that they are, like you mentioned, they're really social and they live in these really big groups. Are they called colonies?
Mm-hmm.
Did
Yep.
I make that up?
And they'll have closer knit family groups called coteries too within the colony. So there's a few different coteries within a colony.
Okay. And essentially talk about like a lot of their life they're living underground, obviously in these tunnels. Mm-hmm. Kind of are they mostly underground? How often do they come up above ground?
They spend about 50% of their time above ground and 50% below. Down below ground is where they'll give birth to their babies. They'll have little latrines. In the winter, they go down there. And a lot of people think that prairie dogs hibernate, at least the Utah prairie dogs here at our southern lower elevations. They just go into torpor, where they just kind of take a nap for the winter. They don't drop their body temperature as much. And they can have little bouts where they wake up and you'll see them up above ground in the snow.
Okay, so not a true hibernation.
No.
Okay. Okay. And they're typically just coming up above ground to eat and drink?
Yeah, they come up usually in the summer months, right around sunrise. They'll spend a good portion of the day, the cool parts of the day, up above ground feeding, watching for predators and that sort of thing. During the extreme hot part of the days, they won't be above ground much. It's just too warm for them up there.
It's too warm for everyone.
It is.
Especially yesterday. I was
we found that out yesterday.
I could dive into one of those burrows right now. That sounds great. It was really hot.
Yep. And then again, you'll see kind of an increase in activity in the evening hours when it cools down. So that's kind of like their daily pattern.
Okay. And what do they typically eat? Like, what is that like?
Mostly, like Jess said, mostly grasses and
Just the
forbs,
grasses
so
and
small leafy plants.
Bugs and stuff that you're talking about?
Yep.
Okay.
They will nibble on shrubs, but not too much. So more or less succulent vegetation.
Okay. So that's why they love alfalfa fields, farmers' fields, things like that. Okay.
Exactly.
It's all making sense now. It's coming full circle. So yeah, kind of going into that, like where typically are they found, like in Utah? Kind of what are those types of habitat areas that are interested in?
Right. They're kind of a typical species that we see in what we call like the shrub steppe ecosystem. So this high desert kind of plains area. They inhabit a lot of the valleys in southwestern Utah, so Cedar Valleys and Parowan Valleys, places like that. Of course, they are in and around urban areas. Decades ago, of course, this area wasn't nearly as settled as it is now. So
Sure.
That's where we see a lot of the conflicts come in with farmers and that sort of thing. But just typically kind of those high, grassland type habitats.
Okay, cool. And let's talk kind of the reason people think about or talk about prairie dogs is right now, like you mentioned, this specific type, the Utah prairie dogs, are threatened. So when were they first listed kind of on the endangered species list?
Yeah, they were first listed on the endangered species list back in 1973 when the list was first created. And then about 10 years later, they were downlisted to the threatened status in 1984. And that's kind of where they've remained since.
Since then, okay. And what was kind of the cause behind them being listed? Like, what was the main causes for their kind of population declines?
Well, back in the early 1900s, populations were estimated near 100,000 animals. And that was kind of based off of a lot of anecdotal observations from, people in the area. But by the 1970s, their numbers were down to 3,000 to 4,000 animals range-wide. So that was kind of, the reason that they first became listed. And that was due to numerous, intensive control campaigns. Obviously, disease can play a big factor in prairie dogs. So there was a lot of, population decline in the mid 1900s, and that ultimately led to their listing.
Gotcha. So people just kind of sick of the damage on their property, just taking matters into their own hands type of thing.
Right.
And then you'd mentioned the disease part of it, and this is kind of interesting to me, obviously, as someone that's not a biologist. I don't know a lot about it, but I have heard they can give plague or carry plague.
They're actually just more susceptible to plague than other animals. So they don't necessarily carry the plague. The plague is actually transmitted through a flea. And fleas obviously, travel across the landscape on all sorts of animals. So the prairie dogs, they don't move a whole lot. So a coyote or a fox may enter a colony, and they're more likely the ones who are actually transmitting the fleas from colony to colony.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So it's not, the prairie dogs aren't really the ones at fault. They just kind of are the ones that get the brunt of it and
that's correct.
End up getting killed. Okay. And that's interesting you mentioned they don't really move very much either. I guess I didn't know that.
So with them being a burrowing animal, their homes, they can't move them. They can't really pick up and move them unless they go to a different spot and dig a new burrow. We do have... in the summer, males will disperse from one colony to another to go try to find new
ladies,
females, yes, to breed with. But generally, when prairie dogs stay within their colonies, their colonies will expand and move a little bit, but they're not just like running across the landscape like a deer or an elk or.
That makes sense. Yeah. How big typically are these kind of tunnel burrow systems in one area? Do they get pretty big?
They can be some. Generally a prairie dog will at least have one burrow entrance and one exit. So depending on how many prairie dogs are in that colony, like we have some farms that'll be the whole 40 acres is a prairie dog colony, but then we'll have some prairie dogs that live in very small areas. As Adam had mentioned, they do live in these urban landscapes, so some of their habitats are very fragmented. So prairie dogs in very small areas that maybe only have 10, 15 burrow entrances and exits. So,
Gotcha.
so it could go from maybe I'd say under an acre up to what's our largest colony, Adam? Do you think?
We have colonies mapped, in the hundreds of acres.
Oh,
So,
wow.
Yeah, pretty big.
Okay, so it is a pretty big area. So you'd mentioned they're currently still listed as threatened on the endangered species list. What are kind of some of the things that we've been doing and other partners have been doing to try and help them, recover and kind of grow their population numbers?
Yeah, that's a great question, Faith. So when they first got listed as a threatened species, the Division of Wildlife played a big role in managing them. Even though they are federally listed species, we started going out and mapping every prairie dog colony and counting every prairie dog colony in the spring so we can monitor their populations. We also do trapping and translocations in the summer, moving prairie dogs from private properties to public lands to help establish new colonies and also reduce those conflicts. Habitat treatments are coordinated with our federal partners. As you mentioned, we have a lot of prairie dogs that live on our BLM lands and our Forest Service lands. And so we work with them to create better habitat for prairie dogs to help create more habitat.
Yeah, yeah.
We also, as Adam mentioned, that they are susceptible to the plague. We do have an intensive dusting program to help suppress the plague where we go out and we dust colonies. There is some research being done on some like oral vaccines and or insecticides that could be used.
So when you say dusting, like, what does that mean? How does that work? I'm like picturing like a crop dust plane that's like dropping like medicine.
That would be a neat way to do it. So what we do is there's little wands and backpacks that carry the dust, and you go around to each burrow entrance and apply the dust around the burrow entrance. So then the prairie dog will come in and out, get that on them, and then that should help reduce flea loads.
Okay, so somebody is like
Physically
actually
on the ground.
physically out like dropping powder on their holes. Okay, that is really interesting. And so that it does seem like that's maybe being successful, kind of reducing disease and death and stuff for them.
Yeah, we've actually been doing some analysis the last couple of years, and one of the things we're looking at is what management actions that we've been using over the past few decades actually impact our count numbers each year. And one of the most positive impacts to prairie dog numbers is dusting treatments.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so it is effective. Like we're like, here's your little daily powder vitamins. Like go on your merry way and don't get the plague. Okay, interesting. And you'd mentioned the habitat work. So talk about like what does that look like? I know we've mentioned a lot on the podcast. Like, we'll take out pinyon trees and plant sagebrush to help mule deer because they like sagebrush in the winter to eat. Like, what does habitat for a prairie dog look like? Like, I mean, what kind of treatments are we doing?
So just one thing to mention is prairie dogs like areas of open vegetation. So we'll have areas that get a lot of shrub encroachment, and prairie dogs like to be able to see around them because they are a prey species. So they want to be able to see if their predators are coming. So they like areas that are open. So a lot of the vegetation treatments will be removing brush, which
I
is the
see.
opposite of what we want to do for mule deer and or sage grouse. But we've been working to make habitat treatments that work for all the animals on the landscape. But a lot of it is brush removal, applying spike treatments to try to keep brush from growing.
So it's like very specific kind of for their species to kind of be what they prefer and what's going to help them recover. Interesting. And we did go out yesterday with the BLM folks that were kind of helping and took some prairie dogs, like relocated them out there after we trapped them. And it was kind of cool because they had these little like burrows already set up. They had these little holes that were like with tubes poking out. We could plop them right down in. But it was, like you said, it was very open. There wasn't really any trees. And so that makes a lot of sense. They can see the hawks coming in or whatever. And on that note, what is kind of the biggest predator for prairie dogs?
Badgers.
Definitely badgers and coyotes.
Okay.
With our translocation sites, we put those in manually. So, typically those prairie dogs that we're moving in have never been in that area. So, when they first, get moved to a new area, they're not quite sure where they're at and what to be looking for. And usually within a few days, the predators key in on them pretty quickly. So, coyotes and badgers, raptors, golden eagles, that sort of thing. So unfortunately, they're at the bottom of the food chain, and everything wants to eat a prairie dog. So
poor little guys, they're just having a hard fight ahead of them. And it is interesting because some of the, like, they're very small, like you said. I mean, they're only 2 to 4 pounds, but some of their holes are kind of big. So I guess that's how badgers dig too, I guess, so they can just make themselves home, just go right in there and find them.
Oh yeah, badgers are like the best diggers. They're like little machines that can just get right down there. And prairie dogs will go ahead after a predator has left the site, go and use those burrows too. So they'll reoccupy them as well.
Okay, so they're smart. They're like, looks like this guy moved out. I did all the work for me.
Somebody else did the work for
Yeah,
me.
I'm moving right in. Okay. And talk about, so you'd mentioned, we do some of the trapping, relocating from private to public lands. And we did, like I mentioned, we did a lot of that yesterday. And I was able to go out this morning and kind of see them setting up traps. So talk about kind of that process, like how we set the traps, where we decide to set them, and what we're like using as bait.
Sure. And trapping and translocation kind of serves two purposes. One, it allows us to deal with conflicts, in and around urban areas, agricultural land. So it gives us an opportunity to move dogs out where they're creating some sort of conflict with humans.
Causing a nuisance. Because
Right.
it can be bad, right? Like for ranchers and farmers. Like I grew up on a ranch. I mentioned that on the podcast. And so it can be hard, if they're tearing up your alfalfa fields or whatever.
Right. When it affects someone's livelihood, it's important to them,
Totally.
So in addition to reducing conflicts, it also allows us to move these animals to protected public lands where they have much more, protections. Typically federal land doesn't get developed. People can't, obtain any sort of kill permits for them on public lands. So it kind of serves a twofold purpose.
Gotcha. Yeah. And yeah, so talk about kind of the process of that. Like where do we pick to set up traps? Just we'll contact the rancher or landowner and just say, hey, can we come? They'll tell us we're having issues, and we'll just come in and say we'll take them out for you.
Yep, and it varies by year. It really does follow the trend of our population. So on years where we have a lot of prairie dogs on the landscape, we get a lot of calls. Hey, I got prairie dogs in my backyard. I got a prairie dog that wandered into my garage. I got a prairie dog that fell into my window well, which is a very common occurrence, believe it or not.
Interesting.
So it really just varies by the year. There is an agricultural damage program called the 4D rule. It's Section 4 in the Endangered Species Act, which provides a mechanism to issue permits to landowners in agricultural and range areas where they're experiencing damage. We can issue a permit that they can lethally control a certain number of those animals.
Sure.
So a lot of times I will reach out to those landowners and ask them if they would allow us to trap animals before they get a kill permit. We get, numerous sources every year, and it varies every year.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what are you guys typically using as bait to kind of lure them in the little cages when you're going to relocate them?
Peanut butter and oats.
butter.
So we'll mix it with the rolled oats so it doesn't just melt right off. But that seems to be pretty effective. It's nice and aromatic and tasty, right? Who doesn't like peanut
I was
butter?
going to say peanut butter is delicious. Yeah, and it is potent, so you can smell it from a mile away.
I think after a few seasons, our technicians learn to hate peanut butter because they use it every day. It's all over their hands. It's all over their clothes. So
They just smell it all the time. They're like, oh, they start associating peanut butter with prairie dogs.
Yeah.
They're like, that's not appetizing. And so kind of for our listeners, kind of walk us through that process. So set the traps, we get some prairie dogs, we go out, check them, bring the prairie dogs back. And then yesterday we did like some processing of them. So kind of talk about what we do then and why.
Sure. We trap usually in the early morning hours when it's cool. The prairie dogs are most active. Typically around midday, our technicians will come back to our office from wherever they were trapping. We meet as a group. We collect all of our prairie dogs, and then we start processing. So what we do is we weigh them. We determine the sex of the animal, the age of the animal, whether it's an immature animal or an adult. And then we actually get them out of the traps using this neat little bag that we have designed. We put it over the trap, and to the prairie dog, it looks like a burrow, so they go running out of the trap into this little bag. And then we put ear tags on the animal. That allows us in the fall or even in coming years, if we were to see that animal or recapture it, we can then look at the ear tags and we can figure out where it was caught and what it weighed at the time and how long it survived.
We were kind of joking yesterday. It's like a day at the salon. They get their ears pierced. They get a little necklace for the little radio collar. It's like a whole thing. They get their hair dyed. So kind of talk about like what's the value of having those radio collars.
Sure. So we're kind of partnering with the BLM the last few years. And what we're really looking at is trying to figure out how to increase our success at our translocation sites. And in years past, we would translocate prairie dogs, and as we go out there day after day, we just don't see many of them staying there. So the idea was, let's figure out what's happening to these animals when we let them go.
Where are they going once we move them? Yeah.
Right. So they're collaring. The first year we used GPS collars, and the last couple of years we're just using radio collars. And then they're tracked every day to determine where they've gone and if they're alive or if they're dead. And if they do get the dead signal on the collar, that collar is retrieved if possible. And then we look and see if we can figure out, what killed it.
Yeah.
And we're hoping that, all this research can lead to greater success of translocations.
And helping them recover, yeah. And you'd mentioned usually when we get like that quote-unquote dead signal from their collars, you said most of those are due to predators, right, usually? Yeah,
pretty much every time we get a collar that is giving off a signal of a dead animal, that it's a predator of some sort.
Gotcha. Okay. And so you kind of touched on this, but kind of one of the biggest misunderstandings with prairie dogs is just the conflicts, right? They dig holes in people's property and cause issues for ranchers and farmers and things. So you'd kind of mentioned some of these kind of solutions, but right now, what's kind of the process? Say I'm a rancher, I'm seeing a bunch of prairie dog holes in my alfalfa fields. Like, what is kind of the process for me to get help or kind of come up with the different solutions to handle that?
Right. Typically, they just contact us. Actually, I've been in this program now for over 10 years, so I've worked closely with most of the landowners in this area, so I know them.
You can just call Adam directly. Just text him. He loves it.
They all have my number. They text me, they call me, they email me.
That's awesome.
And basically what we do is we look at their property, and there are a few requirements to obtain a lethal permit. It has to be of a certain size. They have to have at least X number of animals. And they basically submit an application, and we review that. And as long as they meet the parameters of the program, I can then issue them a permit to lethally control a number of those animals. It's not a complete kill permit. The idea of the program is not to completely eliminate a colony, but to provide them some sort of relief.
Gotcha. And so in that instance, they can't just like put out poison and take out the whole colony. Like, how does that work? Do they do traps as well?
Correct. There's only two legal forms of lethal control, and that is shooting, and kill trapping. So poisons and toxicants and chemicals are not legal because you don't know how many animals you're killing. Sure. Not to mention you can kill all sorts of other species.
Sure.
And it's dangerous to humans as well. So.
Gotcha. And so you're kind of just making sure it's balanced with how many are there, just so we're not further endangering them, and
right.
But we're also giving them the tools to kind of help solve this problem, because it is a problem,
Correct. Yep.
And then the other option, obviously, is they'll call us and we'll try and relocate them sometimes too.
Yeah. I mean, typically, if we have enough staff and time, we offer to trap some of those animals ahead of time if they want to. I mean, it's a willing opportunity for them. They're not required to let us trap. If they want to obtain a lethal permit, we do that. But we'd like to move as many of those animals as possible to make use of them out on public lands.
Totally. And I feel like for anyone listening that's like, well, why wouldn't you just relocate all of them? Like, it's a lot of work, and it takes a lot of manpower, and it is like a big deal. Like, I mean, just yesterday there was a bunch of people involved in kind of that whole process, and it took like the whole day, so it is
right.
like a big, like, there, you have to have the resources, you have to have the time, the funding, whatever. And so I get why they kind of offer both of those solutions. So what is, if, and kind of on the flip side, if someone's like, well, they're a nuisance, so why don't we just kill all of them? Like, why do we need prairie dogs? What would you say, like, kind of why is it important that we're working to help this species?
So Utah prairie dogs, they're a keystone species, so they're really valuable to the environment. Other animals rely on them. Their burrows are great for burrowing owls. They create fire breaks in the environment. They like those areas of low vegetation. They'll often chew the grasses down that they're eating down to just little nubs, which leave actually the most nutrient rich for other animals, for livestock out on the range. And
it can actually, when you say fire break, like, it can actually help reduce fires.
And intensity, of going through like an area that could have been tall cheatgrass or taller brush. An area with lower vegetation is going to slow that.
That's so
down.
Interesting. Okay.
But they're a really neat species. It's great to keep animals part of the ecosystem. Most of these benefits that I just mentioned are more out on the natural landscape where we're trying to establish the populations, but we still need those prairie dogs from those private properties, these source populations where we do have those conflicts, to move them out and establish them to get population numbers high enough so that they can be sustainable
right
on their own.
And I like that you mentioned just, yeah, I mean, obvious. This may seem obvious to us, but to some people that are like, I just don't understand why we need these animals. Like, it is all kind of, not to be Lion King, but it's part of the circle of life, right? And
Exactly.
like, they help provide feed for other animals, as well as, like you mentioned, I didn't know that owls use their holes too, so it's just kind of, they're all helping each other and kind of helping benefit the ecosystem. I think that's important for us to remember, because sometimes if we're like, well, I don't see a direct benefit to me from this animal, we sometimes don't think we need to care, right?
Exactly.
And you guys do awesome work. Yeah, like I said, I was just blown away at how much work went into like all the processing and the catching and the trapping and the moving. Like, we were out in the middle of nowhere taking these prairie dogs. We were like, it is so far, we're gonna die out here maybe, but it was a really cool effort. So I mean, this has been really informative, a lot of good information. If you wanted to boil this down to just like one takeaway, kind of what's the main thing that you want people to understand about this species?
That even though they're a threatened species, there are mechanisms to be able to coexist with them. As we mentioned, that 4D agricultural program where you can get a permit to reduce the impacts to yourself, or trapping and translocations. There was one topic we didn't really touch base on, which is development. Prairie dogs live in these urban areas that were once just fields that are now getting developed into subdivisions, and we have conflicts there. And there are mechanisms to be able to develop and get it. It's just a permitted process. If you're going to be developing in Iron County, Garfield, you first check to see if you need a prairie dog survey, and then we'll go out and determine if there are prairie dogs present and assess the impacts. And if there are prairie dogs there, you just request a permit, and then you're able to go ahead with your project. There is a little bit of mitigation to offset that impact, where those fees go towards creating prairie dog habitat somewhere else, or preserving prairie dog habitat somewhere else, offsetting that ecological balance. So just that there are mechanisms. Just call the division. We're always willing to help. We don't want to see people have these conflicts, and we don't want to see prairie dogs decline. We're trying to recover the species. So whatever we can do to help facilitate that.
We can help both coexist, right? And
Exactly.
it doesn't have to be one or the other. We're not saying people can't live their lives, and but we're also saying, you don't have to eliminate all the prairie dogs to make that happen, right?
Right.
No, I think that's awesome. And yeah, it was really interesting just, being able to be involved in some of the tiny, small portion of the work that you guys do to kind of help this species recover and just learn more about them. So I appreciate you guys letting us kind of tag along and come on the field work and then talk to you guys about this. And for those that are listening, hopefully you've enjoyed this episode and learned a few things. And if you haven't yet, we would love if you could subscribe to the Wild Podcast. We release a new episode on the third Tuesday of each month, and we hope that you'll join us next month for some more wildlife stories.